Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fifth MTSS Gather and Grow Collaborative. We are so happy that you were able to join us today. I know a lot of people are out this week with spring testing, but we're glad for all of you that were able to make it. We have a wonderful speaker today, so let's go ahead and get started.
All right.
We're going
Good
to
morning.
start. Oh, sorry, excuse
Yeah,
me.
go ahead. No, go ahead, Charmaine. Yep.
We're going to start this morning with an introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to Dr. Devin Kearns, and he's going to give us 30 minutes of his time, which we are very grateful for, and then we'll have a moment to ask him some questions. When that section is over, then we are going to um, look at the resources that were sent out to you last week, and you're going to get to go into breakout rooms and speak with some colleagues about what you read and what you picked up from our presenter this morning, and then we'll have just a moment to share before having some announcements and closing. So I would like to introduce Dr. Kearns. He is our last of our 5 Gather and Grow sessions for this year, and he will be speaking on intervention through tiers 2 and tier 2 and tier 3.
It's okay.
You can see, if you would please
She'll get it.
mute your mics, everyone, I would appreciate it. You can see here that there are 2 links for the March and April sessions. Those are the videos of the last 2 sessions. And I also want to remind everyone, if you have not already, to go ahead and put your full name in the chat. In order to get the renewal credit for this, you'll need to have your name in the chat and complete the survey at the end. And we'll talk more about that at the end. I just wanted to remind you to go ahead and put your name in the chat for me. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Devin Kearns. Dr. Kearns is a Goodnight Distinguished Professor of Early Literacy at North Carolina State University at Raleigh. He studied early reading, and he's worked with psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and as we all know is so important, he understands the brain as the basis for reading. He's developed programs to help with reading and content area literacy in middle school classrooms. He's researched best practices for MTSS. He's going to talk a lot about evidence-based systems, which is so critical for what we do, especially with the tier 2 and tier 3, but in tier 1 as well. He frequently visits schools to learn about the reading science and improve their support systems. He's published more than 70 papers. He's spoken in conferences all around the world, and we are so grateful to have him here with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kearns, and I'm going to let you share your screen, so I'm going to
Yep.
stop sharing mine.
Great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to be here as always. I've had the privilege of working with lots of members of the team through the Academic Alliance for South Carolina with Charlene and Susan Thomas and her colleagues and Deanna Parrish and others I can't remember, but I'm really privileged to get to talk with you all about tier 2 and tier 3 this morning. I'm going to concentrate this morning on kind of like the sort of the focus of a program and what you really need to make intervention work in tier 2 and tier 3, and that is having a systematic approach to instruction. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, is sort of the features of an effective program. So I'm going to give you some information about, what are the things that are important to look for in a program, and I'll give you some ideas about sort of how to make some decisions. We'll do a couple activities where I'll give you a chance to kind of reflect on this based on what I've talked about and to get a sense of how these things work. So this slide says, and good intervention program is an essential foundation. And what's really essential is an effective program, one that we know has evidence of supporting students with reading difficulty. And it's important because if we just kind of all do kind of our own thing, then we don't know where we're starting. In other words, in tier 2 and tier 3, we're going to be looking at diagnostic data, right? In tier 2, the way you think about tier 2 should be supplemental instruction, focused on providing support to students who are up to like a grade level below. And the idea of this instruction is that it's really targeted and it has some core features I'll talk about in a minute. And in order to make that instruction maximally effective, you need to do some diagnostic assessment so you know what students actually need. And then when you implement that program, you can address those needs. So it's essentially is you have a program that we know what it contains. And so when you're implementing it, everyone is agreed on what's going on with that. So if students aren't responding to the program, we can identify perhaps the reason for that. If everybody kind of does their own thing, then we don't actually know about that. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. So I'm going to talk about an imaginary case study here of using a program. So in this imaginary case study, there is a school district that implements something called Galactic Literacy, which is an imaginary program. You cannot purchase it. I just made up a logo and that's it. So in this Galactic Literacy imaginary program, it has a foundational skills component. And there are 40 sound spelling cards in that foundational skills program. There are 20 phonological awareness game routines. There's ways to read words with specific procedures. There are routines for spelling and decoding. There are decodable books and there are letter cards. And so I'm going to give you an example of the kind of thing that happens when I visit classrooms sometimes. So if I, Dr. Kearns, I'm talking to Mr. K, call Mr. K, Mr. Kearns or whatever. And if I go to a classroom, and this has happened to me multiple times, and I say, what are you doing with the program? And the teacher will tell me, I change a few things. I always ask the follow-up question like, okay, well, what have you been doing? What have you been changing? And so in this example, the teacher says, I focus mostly on the letter cards and use the words from the phonics. So I want you to think about that for a second. And we're not going to turn and talk exactly, but you can put in the chat, like what percentage of Mr. K's lessons actually reflect galactic literacy, right? To what extent, in other words, is the stuff that he's doing consistent with galactic literacy? So just put a percentage in the chat. I'm going to just take a look at the chat so I can kind of get a sense of what people are thinking. This is not the screen. Let me see. How do I find the screen? While I'm finding the screen, you all can be putting your numbers in the chat. Okay, so we've got scrolling down, nobody yet. So what percentage of the lessons would you say? Less than 30, says Carrie Nichols. Thanks, Carrie. 20% in graph, 20, 20, 15, less than 20 for sure, 15, 0 as intended, Charlene. Charlene might get the, she gets to say what she thinks the right answer is. But yeah, I mean, not a lot. 5% says Tracy Eubanks, just not a lot, right? And this is the problem is that when this happens, when teachers use the program in this way, then we really don't have fidelity to a program at all. We just have kind of random lessons, right? And so the way I think about this is think about it this way, right? If these are the things that are in the program, we think about what the teacher is doing. Is the teacher using the sound spelling cards? No. Is the teacher using those game routines for phonological awareness? No. Is the teacher reading the words with specific procedures? Not the procedures, but using the words. Using those spelling and decoding routines? No. The decodable books? No. The letter cards? Yes. So the teacher took all of the things in galactic literacy and turned it into this, right? And so if we think about that as a program, that's definitely not galactic literacy, right? We could call that something else. So the way I think about it this way, like if we change it from galactic literacy, I'm sorry I made this silly animation, but like just to like emphasize the idea that like you made up your own thing. Like, this is my imaginary program. Like I think I can do better. And so I make up this thing, I call it world famous, just emphasizes like, I think it's the best, even though you have no evidence, and you make it up yourself, that that's the case. Now, certainly we all do lessons and all of, the lessons that we do are carefully designed. But if we don't have if we're not using the program that's evidence-based, then it's probably not ideal. And so what I want to emphasize is that it's a really important thing to find a program that will address student needs in an effective way. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So here are some of the things that you want to see in an effective program. And I'm going to talk about these in order, but let me just kind of summarize them now, and then I'll give you some examples. So for explicit, what I mean by that is that the program provides instructions for the teachers to help the teacher go through the lessons in a way that can be done systematically, or sort of consistently, so that the teachers are always doing the same thing across all their lessons. And this means using a model and practice approach. So modeling being, and I'll show you more about this. I have a slide on this, but modeling being like, I'm going to show you how to do it. Practice being, we're going to do it together, and then you're going to do it with minimal support. Systematic is about getting through an entire continuum of skills. That's a set of skills that the students really need. And that's true for tier 2 or tier 3. And again, this is just to make clear, what I mean here is this is for any program that's designed for students who aren't at grade level. It says here secondary prevention. I should have mentioned this before. Secondary prevention means usually like tier 2. But what I always emphasize is that the secondary prevention programs are also totally appropriate for tier 3. So for students who are significantly below grade level. So when I think about tier 3, I'm talking about kids who are more than a year below grade level, sometimes 2 or 3 years below grade level. These are kids who've demonstrated a long pattern of lack of success in tier 2. So you've done tier 2 for half a year to a year, and they've made minimal progress or just not a lot of progress. And so for all of those students, you want to come up with a secondary prevention program. So again, so explicit I talked about, and then systematic, it reflects the entire continuum of target skills, meaning that you have a scope and sequence that covers all of the things that you believe the students need to know. And you need to figure that out by looking at what the program contains. It also has to have enough lessons to be valuable. I wrote that because some programs designed by researchers are really good, but some of them, when people do research on programs, we don't often have like a whole team writing the curriculum. And so we only have a short, series of lessons. You really need like a program that has enough lessons in it. It needs to be focused on foundational skills. And this is stuff that underpins grade level standards. So in other words, it doesn't have to be the same as grade level standards. This is important because sometimes people think about for tier 2, you should just be like teaching students the standards that they don't understand. That's not the way that I think about tier 2, and that's not the way researchers who studied sort of effective practice for tier 2 have talked about it. What the idea is in tier 2 is that we're providing support for things that are going to help the student get to grade level, but it's not the same thing. And that doesn't mean we're not teaching grade level standards, of course. I'm going to talk about that as well. But it's the idea here is that particularly for tier 2, if we use this program, we can push students up to grade level. And for students in tier 3, probably we can do the same thing, although we're going to be starting at a lower point. And then finally, research or evidence-based, meaning that people have studied it to show that it's effective in multiple studies. Sometimes programs, there are many programs that are, I think, pretty good programs that haven't been researched in that way. And a lot of times the reason they haven't been researched in that way is because it's very expensive to do those kinds of studies that can cost millions of dollars. And so not every person with a really good idea for a program can afford to do that. That doesn't make the programs bad. However, if you're not going to have a program that's actually research-based, you really have to have a program that is strongly based in reading science, right? And you all, I know, have been spending a lot of time talking about reading science over the past few years. And, if you've done any of the work with the Academic Alliance, all of the emphasis on the science reading that's been in their work. And, I know Charlene and her team have focused on that as well. So making sure you have a program that addresses those things. And I know that there's some documents from the state, and Charlene and Susan, if she has a chance to, can share with you some of the resources that they have for you all to look at some of those things. And I'll give you another source too for some things. So one thing I want to talk about before I talk about the features of the program further is differentiation. So one of the things I said was that, we're still teaching grade level standards. So in any lesson where students in any grade or any classroom where students are getting supplemental support in tier 2, for example, they should also be getting tier 1. Everybody gets tier 1. That's also true for students in tier 3. We want to give all students access to grade level content. And the way that we do that is through differentiation, right? So I'm going to read this definition. Differentiation involves ways of adjusting lessons to better meet the needs of students or additional instruction provided to a student or students at a similar level. So the idea here is that we are actually providing support for meeting the grade level standards, right? And so, so this is this is really a key point, is that students, when we differentiate, we need to make sure that it's appropriate for meeting the tier 1 standard. That's not about tier 2 or tier 3. Tier 2 and tier 3 are about the foundational skills. So this is kind of a key point. Differentiation is not tier 2. Okay, let me give you a little more detail about what I mean by explicitness and systematicity. I'm going to show you some examples from a program that actually does exist. I'll show you more about that in a minute. So this is the sort of explicit instruction routine or approach. And so this is a simple representation of the key principles of explicit instruction. So when you do explicit instruction, the lessons have to have an important focus on a skill that's really essential, and a specific measurable learning outcome. We know how we can measure student performance. So if you're doing a lesson on reading words with a short A sound, the goal is for students to read words with a short A sound. So the learning outcome is to see that students can independently read those words. And then any lesson that has that clear objective then has 2 parts in the modeling component. First, you explain the idea, like what it is that students need to know. For example, in the short A case, it'd be like, A says ah. What does it say? Ah, that's right. Let me give you some examples of words where A says ah. I'm going to practice reading words where A says ah. And so the planned examples are things you've come up with ahead of time in order to make sure that the students can learn the objective through the modeling. And then you go into practice, and practice involves 2 kinds of practice: guided practice and then independent. And guided is what we often call we do parts of a lesson. So modeling people also often call I do, and then guided practice is we do, right? So that's where you're doing it with the student, or you sort of model and they repeat. So for example, if you're doing a lesson on A says ah, you would start with cat, you would say, listen, watch me, at, cat, cat. And then I'd say your turn, and the students would repeat that as a way of guiding them through the practice. So they actually do part of it themselves, but they aren't responsible for doing it all by themselves. Then the independent part of the lesson is when the students apply the concept on their own, right? And in the case of the short A, reading words with short A, then I would have a list of words, and I would say, here's a word, sound it out, read it fast, following a routine that I've taught them before for how to read a word in general. So that's that. And then the supporting practices are things that we know are really important for students to be successful. And the first one of these is one of the most important things that you can do is to provide students with lots of opportunities to respond. So it says elicit frequent responses, meaning giving students lots of times that they can respond to you. Data indicate that successful lessons often have more than 3 opportunities for a student to respond within a minute. And I don't mean listening to another kid. I mean that they're actually actively doing something. Immediate feedback is also really important. Even if it's corrective feedback, that's important. And if it's affirmative feedback, that's great too, but it needs to be specific. So students just don't think it's like, oh, good. They know why it's good as well. And then maintaining a brisk pace means just because kids are in tier 2 or tier 3, that doesn't mean slowing everything down in the lesson. We might go more slowly in the sequence of lessons, but within a single lesson, we want to make sure that the lesson doesn't drag on for the students. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from a program that I had the privilege of working on when I was a graduate school. You can't buy this one either because of some of the way that it was designed just made it hard to publish, but so I use it as an example because it's sort of just an example of something that you could apply to your own curriculum evaluation. And I'm going to show you sort of how to think about doing that. So in this National Early Reading Project program that we designed, the program has explicit lessons in it. So this program, we designed it over 10 years ago now, but this is one of the lessons. So this is a teacher script for the lesson, one of the lessons that we designed, right? And you can see here, it has the procedure, and in the bold is what the teacher says. Let's do word spy. I'll tell you which word I spy. You find it, read it, and cover it with a card. And so then you do that lessons. And so one of the things I said about explicit, it has to have clear instructions for the teachers. This does. And in some cases I said it might have a script, and this one does. So it doesn't have to have a script, but having clear directions for teachers for how to actually implement the program is really important. So that's that one. Here's another example of this. You can see here, in terms of the explicit, we need to have the model and practice approach. So you can see here where it says me first. So the teacher is, before the students are doing anything, the teacher is, or the teacher says, watch me. So that's part of that modeling component. And then practice where the student is actually doing it. And so that meets the criteria for being explicit. So systematicity, this is about having a scope and sequence of lessons rather than some general recommendations or no recommendations. And I put those in there because in a lot of cases, when school districts decide to kind of make the lessons themselves, what happens a lot of times is you don't get a complete scope and sequence. So people will kind of come up with general guidelines, but they don't have a scope and sequence. So this is just a sequence of letter sounds that I created for a program that I worked on. And so this is not the one from Nashville. I'll show you that one in a minute. But basically, this is just an example of a sequence chart that was designed by me to help schools kind of identify the degree to which students should be learning letter sounds, right? How many they should be learning and so on. And then the Nashville program, we did that. So we designed it. So this was actually the way we had 110 lessons. So that gets that enough lessons to be valuable. And in there, I did an analysis of like 10,000 words in English and tried to identify what are the most frequent common letter sounds in English. And then we ordered the instruction to follow that. So you can see here, this is, T says T, S says, and so on. We did those in lesson 1, and you can see that the frequency of those kind of declines over time. So we get to, W says woo, that's less frequent than L says ol, and so we did that later. So that reflected the entire continuum of target skills. And we also had, and I said, as I said, they're ordered by sound spelling frequency, and we had 100 lessons. And so these are just some examples of lessons. We had them kind of on these double-sided sheets of paper to make it easy for teachers to do. So this was definitely systematic. It was research-based in an order. It had enough lessons on multiple skills to be valuable, so that met the criteria for being systematic. And then focus on foundational skills. So again, foundational to grade level. It doesn't have to be the same as grade level standards. These are examples of the kinds of foundational skills in reading that you want to see. Again, it depends on the grade level and it depends on the content that students need. So I say here, practicing phonological awareness. Of course, practicing phonological awareness is only something you'll do for students who need skills at a kindergarten or early first grade level. You don't need to do it extensively after that. I know there's been some discussion in the field whether you need lots and lots of extensive phonological awareness. There are no data suggesting students need like multiple years of phonological awareness after kindergarten and early first grade. So, but for some students, that's really important. So if they're at that low level, they need that. And then other things that we need in word recognition are sound spellings. You need to learn a sequence of those. The sequence we created, I can't remember actually, I have, but the one that I have since recommended has about 88 of them. And so the ones that I typically see have somewhere between like 80 and 110 sound spellings in them. And then word recognition also requires decoding routine. For language comprehension, retelling is actually a really important skill. We don't always think about that. Retelling is really important. And identifying main ideas at the paragraph level is really important. I say at the paragraph level because data suggests that when you get students to identify the main idea, sometimes we call it getting the gist, that actually makes a huge difference in terms of student outcomes. And then being able to use syntax is important as well. So this is really about pronoun references. And so one of the things we found in some research is that students can't identify who, if it says she in the second sentence, who she was about in the first sentence. And so we found that really as simple a thing as circle the word and the pronoun reference by drawing an arrow back to it can be really helpful. And then finally, understanding text structure. So like plot structure, for example, or organizational structure for nonfiction, where it maybe has cause and effects in it or has a sequence of ideas in it. Those things are important for language comprehension. So getting back to our Nashville program, it was focused on decoding using sound spelling. We had reading sentences, books, and high frequency words, and we had spelling words based on the sound spelling knowledge that we taught in the rest of the lesson. And then here's what it looked like in the actual lesson. So you can see here, we had embedded phonological awareness practice. That's not there, but we had high frequency word practice. This was the section here. It actually says sight words here, but that was fine. And then we did decoding using sound spellings. This part up here where it says deep and tree, that was decoding using sound spellings. We had encoding practice. You can see here, we had like letter tiles with the D and the E on them and so on. And so we use those as well. And then we had extensions to text reading. So we actually had books that we read. It says here story words because we had the student, we gave the students some words that were going to be in the stories that we hadn't had them practice decoding. So that's how we knew that was focused on foundational skills. In terms of being research-based and evidence-based, so I've already mentioned this, but research-based programs are tested in studies with positive results, usually a randomized control trial experiment or quasi-experiments. That's considered the gold standard. And so evidence-based programs, as I've already mentioned too, they contain best practices, but they might not have the same level of supporting data because they may not have been collected because it's a new program or because they haven't been able to invest the resources to do that. But it's often necessary to have programs that haven't been evaluated in that way. When you think about the tiers of ESSA evidence, it's definitely then, if it doesn't have any data like that, it's the very lowest tier. It would be tier 4, demonstrating a rationale. It wouldn't be actually, an actual, we wouldn't count that as any sort of research on this. I'll say the last thing I'll say about this slide is sometimes people switch these terms. Sometimes people say that research-based programs are the ones that have the best practices and evidence-based programs are the ones that have actually been studied. I think on average, more people write about it this way. That I've written it, research-based means it has actual studies, evidence-based means it's based on best practices but doesn't involve them. But just to note that if you switch these terms, I wouldn't be surprised, but it's pretty common, but it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, and so just to kind of summarize that for the Nashville program, this program was research-based. We tested it in an experiment. We did a randomized control trial, actually, to make sure that happened. And it had positive effects on word reading and on comprehension. And so that made the criteria for being evidence-based. So those are the key components. So what I wanted to do, the last thing I wanted to do was to give you some examples and to have us think about whether or not these actually met the criteria for being effective, right? So I'll just do this one example because it is 9:30 already, but I think it's useful for us to actually do some thinking about this. So a lot of the programs that I am describing here don't exist, first of all. So I made these up. But the idea of these examples is that they reflect the kinds of things that I often see in the field. And so I wanted to share this with you. So let's just talk about these. I'm going to read through this. This is called Reading RNS TM, Reading and Spelling by Making and Sorting Words. It says here, a resource book to help students with dyslexia with lesson ideas and materials. So you already see some red flags here, which says resource book, lesson ideas. That suggests to us maybe that's not systematic because it doesn't have a clear scope and sequence. So let's see if that's true. So it says here, prior research support. Okay, that gets to the research base. Let's look at that. There are papers on reading by RNS developers. Ways RNS includes research-based strategies for word reading and vocabulary learning. So that's not clear that's actual research. And it says endorsements from more than 100 university professors. So writing a paper on reading is not the same thing as actually having evidence that this particular program works. So it might be evidence-based, but definitely the fact that somebody wrote a paper on it is not meaningful. Endorsement from anybody is useless. It's great that some people think that it's effective, but just because somebody says it's really great, that doesn't mean it's actually effective. So in terms of being, research-based, this isn't giving us a good picture of that. Here's some more research information. So here it says average satisfaction of students with dyslexia for reading support out of 10. And this is pre and post, right? So this is pre, they had the score of about 4.5. At post, they had a score of about 8. Here it was 5 and 7. And that suggests that, and they have this little statistically significant effect. So what it shows is that students who did their program are more satisfied. And that may mean that there's some benefit to the program, but it's not an academic benefit. So we don't know at this point whether it has research support. So for research-based, I would say no, and we've just talked about the evidence. Let's talk about the other pieces, the other information that will tell us a little more about the explicit and systematic. So we provide a set of instructional materials, including blocks, charts, rewards, and worksheets. Use materials how you want it. It will still work. So we know here, obviously, this is not evidence-based or, this is not systematic. and it's definitely not explicit. Well, it might be explicit, but this is not systematic, right? So if you can use the materials however you want, that means there's no system to how you actually do it. And probably it means that there's not an explicit set of routines, but we don't know that entirely from this. But we can look at the rest of it, see what it says. So use this with all students. The lessons allow students to understand information about letters and sounds by coming up with their own explanations. So there's the evidence that this is not explicit. So when you do explicit instruction for students below grade level, you want to do the work as the teacher. This is teacher directed instruction. And data indicate that this is really valuable for students who are needing additional support. So sometimes people say like, well, you need the students to, come up with their own explanations because that activates their own way of learning. There are no data indicating that for beginning reading that's actually necessary, because really the letter sound system only works in one way, and there's no need for students to kind of come up with their own explanations when the system has really clear structure to it. And that's particularly true for students who have reading difficulty. And then there are lots of hands-on group activities, that's fine. And thousands of teachers have like this, right? So we don't have evidence that it's explicit. It's definitely not systematic. It is focused on foundational skills for word reading and vocabulary. We didn't have any information about vocabulary, but those are important skills. We kind of have to say like, well, maybe as far as those skills are concerned. So I give this to you as an example so that when you're thinking about looking at a program and trying to decide if you're going to purchase one, this is an example of how you might make a decision about that. So that is all I have to say about programs. There's many more for things you could say, but that is some stuff. I do see some questions in the chat, so I will sort of highlight them. So I'll just note in the chart that oh yes. So actually, I was going to mention this. Susan mentioned the let's see. Okay, here it is. So this is and I'm going to give you, Charlene will give you all the slides for this as well. So there is, as Susan put in the chat, an academic intervention tools chart, and there's the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Hopefully it was defunded as part of the changes in the administration, which in my view is unfortunate because NCII has done a lot of great work providing us with evidence about what is really effective practice. And so there's a lot of evidence on there about programs that have good evidence or not. And so you can look at the National Center website. I think I've been looking at it recently and it still is up. And I think that the people who create it are going to keep it up, but fingers crossed that that's true. And so this will give you some tools to look at for a particular program. So Susan, thank you for mentioning that. And Susan put a link to it in the chat. That's also great. And Susan has also information in the chat from the IRA Center about some resources you can do to look at evidence-based practice summaries. So that's great. So Dr. Houston says, I hope it's Houston, not Houston. Dr. Houston says, what programs do you all use for tier 2 and 3 in high school, if any? I'll leave that to you all to discuss in your groups. Like there are programs I use for those purposes. I always like to not mention programs since it is, it's not my job to talk about programs. I don't want to sort of give you the impression that I think any is particularly, it is, okay, Susan says NCII is still up. So I don't want to sort of, be thought as endorsing a particular one. What I always say is think about whether or not it meets these criteria. Is it foundational to grade level? So if these are high school students in tier 3, say, then you need to have a program that addresses them at their instructional level. So if they're at a middle school reading level where they're working on reading words with endings like TION and things like that, that if that's the level they're at, then you need a program that addresses skills at that level. So that's basically the key, is to find a program that does that. I mean, to your point, Dr. Houston, I think that, or I'm assuming part of your question is well, how do you find something that's not like babyish or whatever, designed for really early elementary kids? And there are programs that are designed for older kids with reading difficulty. And so you can definitely find some that are better or worse. And then Samantha Durrance put in the chat as well. Evidence for S is another good resource. That's a good point they have a list of evidence-based programs as well. And so, yes. And let me just show you one other thing that I skipped over really quickly. So I think one thing I just want to highlight for you all too is that I always talk about completeness and feasibility. Like, how much do you get from the program itself? So you're trying to decide you're going to buy a program. Like, do you get all the stuff with the program? And so, and if not, like, do you have another way to get them, right? So that's what I mean by completeness. Expertise is important too. Sometimes programs come with free professional learning, or it comes with professional learning if you purchase the program, but some don't. And so if you don't have information about how to do the program and your district doesn't have a lot of financial resources, then it can be a real problem to try to implement something that is, new, especially if it's something really complex. And then feasibility is really important too, because you need something that actually is easy to work with. Some programs are not that easy to work with. And so I just want to highlight that as well, that, that's a consideration for you all as well. So that's great. And then M. Moschowitz, I don't know what the name actually is, but asked to review the evidence-based versus research-based, right? So the way that I think about it, and the way that many of my colleagues do, is that research-based means that the program itself has been studied in some kind of quantitative study where the researchers have collected data on student performance to see whether or not the instruction has changed student performance from the beginning of the year to the end, or from the beginning of the study to the end. So I've worked on studies like that before, and what we usually do is we have a group of students, and sometime around October, we randomly assign them to be in our program or to do, continue with the lessons that they already have. And then after like 16 to 18 weeks, we come back and we do pre-testing to see their skills. And at the end, we come back and then we test them again to see if the group that's been given our lessons does better than the group that hasn't done those. So that's an experiment. That's a randomized controlled trial, and that's the gold standard for evidence. Is that evidence-based is basically a program where it's based on best practices. So when you think about the kinds of things that you want to see, I would give you some examples of: you need decoding, you need high frequency word instruction, you need encoding. If it's language comprehension, you need retelling, you need those kinds of things. You don't need all of those in the same program. Like, retelling typically comes before passage comprehension. So after students, understand retelling, then you don't necessarily have to do it anymore. But you need to have those kinds of skills in there. So evidence-based just means it has the right kinds of skills. It may not have been tested itself. Research-based means it's been tested in some kind of way. And randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. So what that means is that if you're thinking about evidence for ESSA, like ESSA tiers, you get the top tier, tier 1, if you've done a randomized controlled trial that has shown positive effects. And then the other tiers involve less extensive evidence. Like tier 3 means that you have done some kind of study to show your program is effective, not comparing it to other programs, but showing that your program gets improvement for students. So that's what that means.
Dr. Kearns, can I ask a question, a follow-up question to that?
Yeah.
And I will say a lot of what we have heard, and you are a researcher, and you are in the world of the research, so I know your definition of research is correct. But my take on the evidence-based is that it has been proven to work with students. Is that not the correct definition? It may not be. I would think it's best if they're research and evidence-based. Like, you want to have something that's got it all. But I may be off on my definition of evidence-based. I agree with the research-based part, 100%.
Yeah. So I think that so the way I think about it, and this is, I think, the way a lot of my colleagues do too, but it's not universal, which is why some people are struggling to think about the way that you said, because people actually sometimes kind of switch these. There's this, really well-known researcher, Reed Lyon, who actually says exactly the opposite of what I said. He says that research-based means it's based on research, but doesn't have it's not researched, and then evidence-based means that it's actually been studied. But anyway, so the way I described it, research-based means you've done the big study, right?
Right.
Evidence-based means it's based on the practices that are effective, but that the program itself hasn't been tested. So in an evidence-based program, you would be including the best practices, but you wouldn't necessarily, you're including the kinds of things you'd expect to see, like decoding routines. But it doesn't mean you've actually tested the program itself. And I often feel like that's okay because it's really hard and expensive to test, programs extensively, but that doesn't mean they're not necessarily good. But you do need to evaluate them carefully if they don't have research, right? It's, I think, a higher standard, more rigor you need to go through and really convince yourself that this program is actually effective.
Because I think for those in the field, we really want to know that what we're using has been proven to work. So
That's right.
we want to make sure we understand the terminology in terms of if someone says they're evidence-based or research-based, what are they implying? Because we want to
That's
make sure
right.
we're finding what's proven to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Dr. Crotwell's sort of question sort of gets at this kind of point of like what do we mean? So when I say research, what I mean is it actually has been tested with students. So so that it's not just research, meaning like somebody did some laboratory experiment. What
Right.
to me research means is like you actually went into schools and did this, right? Which I know what you were thinking, but I just want to make sure that I was clear about that. So that's actually research-based doesn't just mean that you did it in the university. Research-based should still be done with students in a real classroom. And evidence-based is kind of like that lower standard as well. And so evidence-based is also really important. Should you strive for both? So I would say the answer is yes and no. The reason I say and no is that I believe there are good programs that have not been studied in that same way, right? That there are programs that haven't been researched on their own, not because they're not good or couldn't be studied in that way. It's just that because of the kind of the barrier to entry to doing that, which is to say the amount of money it takes to do it, because of that, it's really hard sometimes for programs to make, to be able to do that. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't, and good programs should do that. I think more research, I've been working with one group that is actually doing that. They're working on, working with researchers to evaluate their program because they want to really know, like, does this program really work? And so research-based is absolutely better. And I think over time, hopefully we'll get more and more programs that are actually research-based. But my feeling is that just because no one has done a study of this program, that doesn't mean that the program is necessarily bad. If you have evidence that the program is effective, that's even better. If you have research for a study on your program with students, then I think that's definitely better. But I just don't want people to like throw out the program because it's like, well, nobody ever studied this, so we should not use it. I don't think that's the right answer, right? So.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And so Samantha Durant's put in the chat. I'll read this aloud too. Evidence-based program, a collection of practices that when used together has been proven to work through experimental research studies or large-scale research fields. It's kind of confusing even here because it's a collection of practices, right? But is it when it says when used together has been proven to work? I don't even know there if they mean that the practices themselves have been shown to work or whether or not the program has been shown to work. So I think that's pretty unclear, but the way I would read that, I think this is the correct way.
Sorry. Ignore that. That's my timer, but we can keep going. We're not done, so it's all good.
Okay. Yeah. So I just say, okay, I'll stop in a second, but I would just say, like, to me, again, evidence-based means it has things that are based on evidence that people have studied those practices and know those practices are effective, but that the program itself hasn't been tested in that way. Yeah. So, and yes, this would apply to math programs as well, for sure. So, yeah. So I will turn it back to you, Charlene.
I wanted to thank you also for emphasizing the difference between differentiation in Tier 1 and the need for that systematic instruction in Tier 2, that it's not just a little extra work, that it has to be systematic and explicit in Tier 2. So that I think that's something that we all strive to remember and do.
Yep.
I think we have like a semi-strong understanding of Tier 1 and of Tier 3, but Tier 2 kind of gets lost. A lot of times I see people jump to intense, and maybe that's because we have a lot of students that are either on grade level or severely below grade level, but we still have to identify those kids that are just slightly below and make sure we're giving that systematic instruction to help them to avoid slipping into the tier 3 space. We want to make sure we have all children's needs being met. And when you have that tier 3, you have tier 1 and tier 2 instruction as well. So I appreciate your clarity on tier 2.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it's really important. So I just put in the chat too, like someone said, well, what about math? Well, I always recommend my colleague Sarah Powell. She's actually done some work on math herself, and Lynn Fuchs, who a colleague of mine who worked just recently passed away, but she has done amazing work in this area, and has been a real champion for this work. And so I think looking at the work that they've done and getting some evidence from that, I think would be really good. So, and then
Okay.
Samantha Durant's again put a link to evidence for us in the chat. So those are good things as well. And Samantha Durant's also noted, like in terms of the ESSA tiers, make sure, in terms of what you actually purchase, that whatever the guidance is from the state, you make sure to follow that. So.
Well, I wrote down Sarah Powell's name. We're going to try to get a collection of speakers next year as well. So we may try to
Oh yeah, she's
get her if
the
she's
best.
available.
She's
So,
absolutely the best.
and I want to thank Academic Alliance of South Carolina for helping so much with securing our speakers for this year, because we've had some outstanding speakers. And Devin, thank you so much for coming today. We know your schedule is busy, and we really
Pleasure.
appreciate your time. And we are going to move to the next section of our PD. You're
Great.
welcome to
All
stay,
right.
but you
Bye,
don't
everyone.
have to. Okay.
I'm going to go to the next thing I've got, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Devin.
And I'll send you the slides so you can share them with everyone.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yep. Bye.
Bye. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. And I'll have, oh dear. 1 second. Stop sharing instead of stop the recording. Let me try that one more time.